Marcus Thompson had always believed in the power of hard work. Born and raised in a small town on the outskirts of a bustling city, he knew early on that life would not hand him anything without effort. His father had worked long hours as a mechanic, and his mother had taken care of the family while also tending to a small vegetable garden in their backyard. From them, Marcus learned the value of perseverance, patience, and pride in one's work. By the time he reached adulthood, he had internalized the principle that every brick you lay, every nail you hammer, and every seed you plant carried meaning beyond the immediate reward. It was not just labor, it was identity. After years of saving and careful planning, Marcus purchased a modest plot of land just outside a suburban community governed by a homeowners association, or HOA. The area was picturesque, with neatly trimmed lawns, paved roads, and a private resort lake that reflected the sky like a mirror. To outsiders, it seemed like paradise, but Marcus knew the community's polished appearance came with strict rules and regulations. While some residents enjoyed the benefits of a controlled environment, others quietly resented the HOA's interference in matters that often seemed trivial or worse, selectively enforced. Marcus had heard the stories before moving in, stories of neighbors who had been fined, ordered to remove structures, or even threatened with legal action for minor infractions. But he believed that as long as he followed the rules, he would be safe. On his property, Marcus built a small barn. It was not grand or ostentatious, but it was sturdy and practical. He had constructed it with his own hands, sometimes working late into the night after a long day at his job. The barn was a place of creativity and labor, a sanctuary where he could store tools, fix machinery, and even experiment with small woodworking projects. It became a symbol of his independence and self-reliance. For Marcus, the barn was more than wood and nails, it was a testament to his effort, his dreams, and his right to exist on his own terms. For months, life on the edge of the HOA community seemed peaceful. Marcus would wake up early, tend to his small garden, and work on his barn or other projects. Occasionally, he would walk down to the lake, enjoying the reflection of the trees on the water and the quiet hum of nature around him. He felt connected to the land, grounded by the rhythm of daily work and the satisfaction of tangible accomplishments. At night, he would sit on the porch with a cup of tea, thinking about how far he had come, how the sweat and patience of years had culminated in this small slice of freedom. But the peace was fragile. Marcus began to notice letters from the HOA slipping through his mailbox, their tone polite on the surface but carrying unmistakable authority beneath. They spoke of violations regarding his barn, its proximity to property lines, the materials used, and even the paint color. Marcus was puzzled. He had double-checked every regulation before building the barn and had been careful to follow every guideline. Moreover, other residents had structures far more extravagant and out of compliance, yet they had never received a single notice. Something about the situation did not feel fair, but he tried to remain calm. He wrote back politely, requesting clarification, and even offered to attend a meeting with the HOA to discuss the matter. The response, when it came, was dismissive. The HOA insisted that Marcus's barn violated the community's guidelines and that he must remove it immediately. They provided no flexibility, no room for discussion, and no acknowledgement of the effort Marcus had put into building the structure. It was as if the barn, a creation of his own labor, had no meaning in their eyes. Marcus felt a surge of frustration, but he tried to remain composed. He knew anger would not help, and he wanted to resolve the situation without confrontation. Still, he could not ignore the growing sense of injustice. Days turned into weeks, and the HOA's notices became more frequent and insistent. Marcus found himself standing in front of his barn one morning, hands on his hips, staring at the wooden beams he had labored over for months. He remembered the first day he had dug the foundation, the nights he had stayed up measuring and cutting planks, and the satisfaction he had felt as the barn slowly took shape. Now, those memories were overshadowed by the threat of demolition. It was not just about the structure itself, it was about respect, fairness, and acknowledgement of his effort. The realization settled heavily on his shoulders, the fight ahead would not be easy. Neighbors began to notice the tension. Some whispered words of sympathy, others avoided the topic entirely, fearing the HOA's reach. Marcus tried to engage with community members who seemed supportive, sharing his concerns and seeking advice. He learned that a few residents had faced similar treatment, often due to subtle biases or misunderstandings about property rules. These stories only reinforced his feeling that the HOA wielded power in a way that was sometimes arbitrary and selective. He felt the weight of not only personal struggle but also systemic imbalance, a frustration that was both familiar and infuriating. Despite the mounting pressure, Marcus did not give up. He began documenting everything: letters, notices, conversations, and photographs of his barn and its placement on his property. He wanted to create a clear record of his efforts, hoping it might offer protection or at least clarity if the situation escalated. Every day, he worked quietly, maintaining his routines, tending to his garden, and ensuring the barn remained in good condition despite the looming threat. The act of continuing his work became both a coping mechanism and a silent form of resistance. The conflict reached a breaking point when the HOA, after weeks of ignoring Marcus's appeals, sent a demolition team to his property. Early one morning, workers arrived with heavy equipment and began dismantling the barn piece by piece. Marcus rushed to the scene, heart pounding, but was stopped at the edge of his property. He could only watch as the barn, once a proud symbol of his labor and independence, was reduced to a pile of wood and nails. Anger, sorrow, and disbelief surged through him in waves. He felt violated, not just as a homeowner but as a person whose hard work and rights had been dismissed without genuine consideration. In the days that followed, Marcus walked through the remnants of the barn, running his hands over the splintered wood. He reflected on everything that had led to this moment: the effort, the patience, the hope that fairness might prevail. And yet, beneath the grief, a spark of determination grew. He realized that giving up would mean accepting injustice, and that was not an option for him. Marcus began to think carefully about his next steps, considering ways to respond that were both meaningful and strategic. The loss of the barn had been painful, but it had also ignited a sense of purpose, a resolve to reclaim agency over his life and his property in ways that demanded respect. It was during these quiet, reflective moments that Marcus noticed something unusual near the HOA's resort lake. While taking his evening walk, he saw the dam valve, a metal mechanism controlling the water flow into the lake. It was secured but not heavily monitored, and its presence sparked an idea. Marcus did not rush, he simply observed, studying how the system worked and imagining possibilities. In the weeks that followed, he read manuals, consulted online guides, and spoke with engineers informally, always emphasizing safety and legality. He wanted to understand the mechanics thoroughly before taking any action. Through all of this, Marcus remained grounded by his core values. He knew that retaliation without thought could lead to serious consequences. Yet, he could not ignore the imbalance of power he had experienced. His thoughts often returned to the barn, the labor it represented, and the injustice of its destruction. These reflections were no longer just about loss, they became a catalyst for action, a plan that would allow him to assert himself and make a statement without causing real harm. By the end of this period, Marcus had transformed his grief and anger into careful determination. He understood that his next steps had to be precise, symbolic, and clever. He was no longer a man merely reacting to injustice, he was becoming someone who could challenge an institution in a way that demanded attention and respect. The stage was set for the next phase of his story, a phase where intelligence, patience, and courage would collide, and where Marcus would find a way to make his voice heard without resorting to recklessness or destruction. After the destruction of his barn, Marcus felt a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, frustration, and disbelief mixed with the heavy weight of injustice he had endured. Every morning, he woke to the reality that the structure he had built with his own hands, the symbol of his hard work and independence, was now gone. Walking past the remains, the broken wood and scattered tools seemed to mock him. Yet, even in the midst of grief, Marcus's mind was working, turning every thought, every observation, into a plan. He had been pushed into a corner, and now he was determined not just to survive, but to respond in a way that would demand recognition of his dignity and resilience. The HOA had acted quickly, confident in their authority. Notices, letters, and meetings had been ignored or dismissed by them, but Marcus refused to let their actions define his life. He began speaking quietly with neighbors who were sympathetic, asking about their experiences with the HOA. Some shared stories of similar struggles: minor infractions blown out of proportion, fines imposed without warning, and arbitrary enforcement of rules. Others, wary of the HOA's reach, refused to speak at all. The community was divided, some intimidated by the association's power, others quietly watching Marcus as he grappled with his loss. These conversations helped him understand the broader context of the HOA's control. It wasn't just about his barn, it was about the selective application of rules and the imbalance of power within the community. Marcus spent days documenting everything meticulously. He photographed the remains of his barn, the site, and even areas around neighboring properties where similar structures had remained untouched. He collected copies of all HOA communications, noting dates, times, and the inconsistencies in their enforcement. Every detail mattered. Marcus understood that knowledge was power, and preparation could give him leverage, whether in future legal actions or in defending his reputation within the community. It was not revenge he sought, but fairness and recognition. During this period, Marcus also found solace in routine. He maintained his small garden, fixed minor equipment, and continued small projects unrelated to the barn. These activities grounded him, reminding him that his life was larger than the conflict with the HOA. Even as he planned, he stayed connected to the rhythms of work and life, finding strength in the familiar. The contrast between the serenity of his personal projects and the turmoil of the HOA conflict made the injustice feel even sharper, but it also clarified his determination. He would act, but he would act thoughtfully. One afternoon, while walking near the lake, Marcus noticed how the water level affected the docks, the small boats, and the shoreline. The HOA's resort lake was a focal point of the community's status and pride. It was heavily managed, with rules that dictated who could access it and how. Yet, in his observation, Marcus realized that certain aspects of the system were exposed, particularly the dam and valve that controlled water flow. It was a subtle oversight, but to someone who knew what to look for, it represented an opportunity. Marcus did not rush, he simply took note and continued observing. Over the next few weeks, Marcus researched the mechanics of the lake system. He read manuals on small dam operations, watched online tutorials on water management, and spoke informally with engineers and contractors who had experience with similar systems. He asked questions carefully, making sure to frame his inquiries around general knowledge rather than specific action plans. He needed to understand the system thoroughly, not to cause harm, but to explore a method of asserting himself and highlighting the unfairness he had endured. The research became a mental exercise, sharpening his focus and patience. As he studied, Marcus also considered the broader implications of any action he might take. He wanted to respond in a way that would be symbolic and non-destructive. He was determined to avoid illegal activity that could cause permanent damage, harm others, or put him in serious legal trouble. This was not about revenge in a destructive sense, it was about strategy, creativity, and sending a message that the community could not ignore. The more he learned about the water system, the more he realized that a carefully measured intervention could temporarily disrupt the resort's operations without causing real harm to the lake or its environment. The idea of action, though, was tempered by the need for caution. Marcus knew the HOA could respond aggressively, possibly escalating the situation in ways that could backfire. He spent hours envisioning potential scenarios, weighing risks and outcomes. His goal was not to intimidate, but to highlight injustice. He wanted the community to recognize the imbalance, to see that the removal of his barn was not a fair or neutral act. This internal planning required patience, reflection, and restraint, qualities Marcus had honed over years of life experience. During this time, Marcus also reflected on his own values and principles. He remembered the lessons his parents had taught him about integrity, perseverance, and fairness. Acting recklessly would have gone against everything he believed in. Instead, he focused on strategy. He realized that sometimes the most powerful statements were made not with aggression, but with intelligence and precision. A measured, thoughtful response could achieve far more than a rash reaction. This mindset kept him centered, even as frustration simmered beneath the surface. Marcus began to envision his next steps with increasing clarity. He imagined a temporary adjustment to the dam valve that would lower the water level slightly, enough to cause noticeable disruption for the HOA's resort operations but without damaging the lake or surrounding ecosystem. The goal was to make a point, to demonstrate that power could be challenged thoughtfully and effectively. It was a symbolic action, one that mirrored the sense of loss and injustice he had experienced with the barn. The lake, a centerpiece of the HOA's pride and control, would serve as the stage for a demonstration of careful resistance. Even as Marcus planned, he remained aware of potential consequences. Legal ramifications, community perception, and environmental impact were all factors he considered. He did not act impulsively, every detail was weighed carefully. Marcus's preparation involved not just studying the mechanics, but also anticipating reactions. He visualized conversations with HOA representatives, media attention, and responses from neighbors. By thinking through these scenarios, he ensured that his actions would remain measured and defensible. The community, meanwhile, began to notice a change in Marcus. He moved with quiet purpose, no longer just a homeowner frustrated by bureaucratic overreach, but someone who was thinking strategically and observing carefully. Friends and sympathetic neighbors saw the shift and offered quiet support, though most remained cautious. The HOA, unaware of Marcus's observations and planning, continued with its regular operations, confident in its authority. Marcus knew that this confidence would make any subtle intervention more noticeable, amplifying the impact of his planned response. Weeks passed, and Marcus's resolve strengthened. He revisited the site of the barn occasionally, reflecting on the contrast between what had been and what could be. The destruction had been painful, but it had also served as a catalyst for creativity and strategic thinking. Marcus had moved beyond simple frustration, he was now planning a response that was symbolic, intelligent, and non-destructive. The act of planning itself became empowering, a way to reclaim agency and assert his rights without resorting to aggression. Throughout this time, Marcus continued his routine, blending normal life with careful observation and planning. He maintained his garden, repaired small machinery, and even rebuilt some of his tools, using these activities to stay grounded. These routines served as a reminder that his life extended beyond conflict, that he could find satisfaction in daily labor even amidst injustice. Yet the desire for meaningful action remained, a quiet flame that guided his thoughts and decisions. By the end of this period, Marcus had formed a clear plan. He understood the mechanics of the lake system, the potential impact of manipulating the dam valve, and the ways to execute his idea safely and responsibly. He had also considered timing, visibility, and the message it would send to the HOA and the community. Marcus was no longer merely reacting to injustice, he was preparing a deliberate, symbolic act that would demonstrate resilience, intelligence, and strategic thinking. He had turned loss into opportunity, grief into focus, and frustration into action. As Marcus looked out over the lake one evening, the water reflecting the setting sun, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The barn had been destroyed, yes, but he had gained insight, preparation, and clarity. The conflict with the HOA was far from over, but Marcus was no longer powerless. He was thinking strategically, planning carefully, and preparing to make a statement that would be both measured and meaningful. The stage was set for the next phase of his journey, one in which intelligence, patience, and courage would collide in a way that could not be ignored. Marcus had spent weeks preparing, observing, and planning, and now the time had come to move cautiously toward action. The knowledge he had gained about the lake's dam valve gave him confidence, but he remained acutely aware of the need to act carefully. This was not about aggression or revenge, it was about asserting his dignity, making a statement, and reclaiming a sense of control over a situation in which he had been wronged. Every step required focus, precision, and patience. One wrong move could turn his symbolic action into something dangerous, and Marcus was determined to avoid that. He began by revisiting the lake at different times of the day, taking mental notes on the flow of water, the level of activity, and the routines of HOA staff. Early mornings were quiet, with few people around and a stillness that made observation easier. Afternoons were busier, with maintenance crews and residents walking near the water. Marcus realized that timing would be critical. Any intervention had to be subtle, brief, and strategic to avoid unnecessary confrontation or misunderstanding. He also examined the surrounding area, noting pathways, sightlines, and possible places for observation without drawing attention. His experience with his barn had taught him the importance of preparation and foresight. During these walks, Marcus allowed his mind to reflect on the lessons he had learned over the past months. The barn had been a place of labor, creativity, and pride. Its destruction had been painful, but it had also been transformative. He had been forced to think deeply about fairness, power, and strategy, and in that reflection, he had discovered a new strength within himself. Every detail of his plan now carried significance, from the timing of his approach to the smallest adjustment he intended to make. He wanted to demonstrate that intelligence and careful planning could stand in the face of arbitrary authority. Marcus prepared his tools carefully. Unlike the heavy machinery used to demolish his barn, this plan required only simple equipment, gloves, a flashlight, and basic hand tools to make a controlled adjustment to the valve. He checked and rechecked each item, imagining scenarios where they might be needed or not, ensuring that he would be ready for any situation. His meticulous attention to detail reflected his desire to act responsibly. Nothing in his plan was meant to cause harm, it was meant to be a clear and temporary signal, visible enough to make an impact but safe enough to avoid permanent consequences. On the day he decided to act, Marcus woke early, just as the first light of dawn touched the tops of the trees. The community was quiet, most residents still asleep, and the lake shimmered in the soft morning light. Marcus approached the dam slowly, blending with the natural surroundings, careful to avoid any paths where he might be noticed. His heart raced not with fear of confrontation, but with the intensity of purpose. Every step was deliberate, every movement measured. This was not a reckless venture, it was the culmination of weeks of thought, observation, and planning. When he reached the dam, Marcus paused to observe it carefully. The metal valve stood before him, sturdy and unassuming. He remembered every detail he had learned during his research: the way the handle turned, the resistance of the mechanism, and the potential impact of adjusting it slightly. With steady hands, he prepared to make the adjustment, confident that it would achieve the symbolic effect he intended, a noticeable lowering of the lake's water level, just enough to disrupt the HOA's resort operations temporarily without causing any real damage to the ecosystem or property. As he turned the valve slowly, Marcus thought about the barn, the injustice, and the message he wanted to send. This action was not about retaliation in a harmful sense, it was about visibility, strategy, and fairness. The lake was a centerpiece of the HOA's pride, and his adjustment would create a situation they could not ignore. For Marcus, it was a statement: authority cannot dismiss labor, fairness, and respect without consequence. Every rotation of the valve felt deliberate, controlled, and purposeful. Within minutes, Marcus noticed the change in the water level. It was subtle but significant. The docks sat slightly higher, the edge of the lake receded just enough to be visible, and small boats shifted gently in response. He stepped back, observing the effect with satisfaction. The action had been precise, measured, and safe. There was no damage, no disruption to wildlife, and no permanent impact on the lake itself. Marcus allowed himself a small, quiet smile. This was his response to injustice, clever, responsible, and undeniable. As he made his way back, Marcus considered the potential reactions. The HOA staff would soon notice the water level change, and residents might talk about it. He knew that some would be confused, others might be alarmed, and some might even suspect that it was a coincidence. But Marcus understood that even a subtle disruption could spark curiosity, questions, and awareness. He had not needed to act aggressively to make a point. The lake, a symbol of the community's control and pride, had been used to communicate his message clearly, safely, and strategically. Over the next several days, the effects of Marcus's actions became apparent. HOA staff were seen inspecting the dam and discussing the changes, their concern evident in hushed conversations. Residents noticed the unusual water levels at the lake, prompting discussions and speculation. Marcus observed all of this from a distance, careful not to reveal his involvement. He felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his plan had achieved visibility without causing harm. The community's attention had shifted subtly, creating awareness of the power dynamics at play and the potential consequences of arbitrary authority. Despite the satisfaction, Marcus remained grounded in responsibility. He monitored the valve, ensuring that water levels returned to normal after a controlled period. He had no desire to create lasting problems, his goal was to make a point about fairness and respect, not to cause destruction. This restraint reflected his character and values, emphasizing that intelligence and strategy could be more effective than aggression or impulsive retaliation. Marcus had taken control of the situation in a way that honored his principles while sending a clear message. During this period, Marcus also noticed a change within himself. The planning, observation, and careful action had strengthened his confidence, patience, and resilience. He realized that injustice, while painful, could serve as a catalyst for creativity and strategic thinking. He had turned frustration into constructive action, and in doing so, he had reclaimed a sense of agency and self-respect. The experience reinforced his belief that measured, intelligent responses could stand up to authority and challenge unfairness without resorting to recklessness. Neighbors began to talk quietly, some expressing curiosity about the unusual water levels, others discussing the fairness of the HOA's actions. Marcus observed these conversations with a sense of detachment and satisfaction, knowing that the awareness he had created was spreading organically. The lake had become a stage for reflection and discussion, and Marcus's careful planning had ensured that the message was clear: power should not be exercised without consideration, and labor and effort deserve respect. The HOA, meanwhile, faced questions they had not anticipated. Staff inspected the dam, checked machinery, and debated among themselves what could have caused the temporary change in water level. They had never expected a subtle, intelligent response to a personal grievance, and the lack of permanent damage frustrated them further. Marcus watched from a distance, understanding that sometimes the most effective form of influence is subtle and strategic, rather than loud and confrontational. The lesson, he realized, was in the precision and responsibility of the action itself. Throughout this period, Marcus continued his daily routines. He tended to his garden, repaired tools, and worked on other personal projects. These activities kept him grounded, reminding him that life extended beyond conflict. Yet the lake incident had marked a turning point. Marcus had transformed frustration and grief into focused, intelligent action. He had demonstrated that injustice could be challenged thoughtfully, that careful planning could make a statement, and that resilience was not just about enduring difficulty, but about responding with integrity and strategy. By the end of this period, Marcus had established a pattern of observation, careful action, and reflection. He had reclaimed a sense of control, made a symbolic statement about fairness, and demonstrated the power of intelligence and patience. The lake, once merely a picturesque feature of the HOA's resort, had become a stage for thoughtful resistance. Marcus had learned that even small, controlled actions could have meaningful impact, and that maintaining principles while challenging authority was both possible and effective. As he watched the water settle back to its normal level, Marcus felt a quiet satisfaction. He had taken action without causing harm, asserted himself without resorting to aggression, and sent a message that could not be ignored. The barn had been destroyed, but he had turned loss into opportunity, frustration into strategy, and injustice into a platform for awareness. The experience strengthened his resolve and prepared him for the next steps in his journey, where intelligence, patience, and courage would continue to shape his response to the challenges he faced. Word of the lake incident spread quickly through the community, carried by whispers, speculation, and casual conversations. Residents gathered in small groups near the clubhouse, by the sidewalks, and at the grocery store, discussing the mysterious change in water levels. Some were confused, others frustrated, and a few began to speculate wildly about the cause. The HOA had never expected such an unexpected disruption, and their reaction now became a mixture of panic, investigation, and defensiveness. Marcus observed quietly from a distance, careful to remain unnoticed, but he could not help feeling a mix of curiosity and satisfaction. The ripple effect of his actions was unfolding exactly as he had hoped, drawing attention without creating chaos. HOA officials held an emergency meeting, convening staff, managers, and a few select board members to discuss what had happened at the lake. The atmosphere was tense, filled with frustration and a sense of urgency. The temporary drop in water levels had disrupted a few scheduled events and recreational activities, prompting complaints from residents who used the lake for morning walks, paddleboarding, and fishing. The HOA was caught off guard, struggling to understand how such a minor but noticeable change had occurred. Some staff members suggested technical issues with the dam, while others whispered about sabotage. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to observe discreetly, taking notes in his mind rather than on paper. He watched the HOA staff examine the dam, checking for mechanical failures or evidence of interference. They inspected valves, machinery, and surrounding infrastructure, but nothing seemed out of place beyond the water level itself. Their frustration grew with each passing hour, and Marcus realized that his plan had succeeded. The action had created visible disruption without causing any actual damage. It was a clear demonstration of careful, thoughtful strategy and intelligent response that left the HOA scrambling for answers. Residents began to talk more openly, sharing their thoughts on social media and neighborhood forums. Some blamed natural fluctuations in the lake, while others suggested that the change was intentional, caused by someone with inside knowledge. Discussions about fairness, power, and respect began to surface. Marcus noticed that many residents were starting to question the authority of the HOA and its handling of disputes. Conversations about the community's leadership, decision-making processes, and responsiveness to grievances began to emerge. The subtle impact of Marcus's action was transforming into broader awareness. In the midst of this, Marcus reflected on the lessons he had learned. The destruction of his barn had been a painful experience, one that exposed the imbalance of power within the community. However, the lake incident allowed him to respond thoughtfully, demonstrating intelligence and patience rather than aggression. He realized that fairness and respect could be asserted without conflict or confrontation. By acting carefully and responsibly, he had not only reclaimed a sense of control but also sparked reflection among his neighbors. The incident had become a catalyst for dialogue about justice and authority. The HOA, growing increasingly desperate for answers, decided to involve external experts. Engineers and maintenance professionals were brought in to inspect the dam, review water levels, and verify the integrity of the system. Marcus watched as they examined equipment, took measurements, and discussed possible scenarios. He understood that this was exactly the reaction he had anticipated: careful analysis, investigation, and discussion, all prompted by his subtle yet effective intervention. It reinforced his belief that intelligence and strategy could accomplish more than confrontation or anger ever could. Residents continued to observe and comment, some with curiosity and others with mild anxiety. People began to speculate on potential culprits, creating a quiet buzz of conversation around the neighborhood. Marcus noticed that even those who had once dismissed him or ignored his concerns were now paying attention. The lake incident had shifted perspectives subtly, demonstrating that the community could not take fairness, effort, or labor for granted. Marcus felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his message was spreading without his direct involvement, proving that thoughtful action could influence others effectively. Despite the attention and speculation, Marcus remained cautious. He avoided drawing attention to himself, maintaining a routine that seemed ordinary and uneventful. He continued tending to his garden, repairing tools, and engaging in everyday activities. By keeping a low profile, he ensured that the focus remained on the situation at the lake rather than on himself. This restraint was intentional. He understood that lasting impact came from the clarity of the action, not the notoriety of the actor. Over the next few days, tensions in the community began to rise. HOA staff received complaints from residents who had noticed unusual water patterns, while others demanded explanations for potential safety concerns. The lake, once a serene feature of the neighborhood, had become a point of discussion, concern, and scrutiny. Marcus observed these developments with careful detachment, noting how the community responded under pressure. He realized that his small, precise action had created awareness, discussion, and reflection without ever needing to escalate into conflict. Some residents began to question the HOA's decisions more openly. Conversations about fairness, accountability, and leadership surfaced at community gatherings and online forums. People debated policies, decisions, and past incidents, often referencing the lake without naming a cause. Marcus noticed that even casual conversations had shifted in tone. The community was beginning to think critically about authority and power, sparked by a subtle and intelligent act rather than confrontation. This realization reinforced Marcus's sense of accomplishment and pride. Meanwhile, Marcus also felt a growing responsibility. He knew that the situation could escalate if misinterpreted or mishandled. While he had acted thoughtfully, he could not control every reaction or rumor. This awareness reminded him of the importance of measured action, foresight, and patience. He understood that intelligence alone was not enough. Careful planning and restraint were essential to ensure that the situation remained safe, constructive, and effective. Marcus's experience with the barn had prepared him for this moment, teaching him the value of strategy, observation, and ethical decision-making. As the days passed, the HOA attempted to stabilize the situation. Staff adjusted machinery, conducted additional inspections, and communicated with residents to reassure them that the lake was safe. Despite their efforts, the community remained aware that something unusual had occurred, and discussions continued. Marcus recognized that this awareness was the true outcome of his efforts. The message was not about punishment or revenge, it was about reflection, responsibility, and the importance of fairness. His action had created visibility and dialogue without causing harm. Marcus also observed the reactions of neighbors who had previously been indifferent or dismissive. Many were now asking questions, discussing fairness, and considering the balance of power within the community. Conversations about leadership, accountability, and respect became more common. Marcus realized that his small, thoughtful action had achieved something significant. It had sparked critical thinking, awareness, and conversation. These effects were more powerful than any act of anger could have been, proving that intelligence, patience, and responsibility could influence change in meaningful ways. In the evenings, Marcus would sit by his window and reflect on the unfolding events. He thought about the barn, the lake, and the lessons he had learned along the way. He understood that standing up for fairness did not require aggression, confrontation, or risk. Instead, it required careful observation, thoughtful planning, and measured action. Marcus felt a sense of pride and calm, knowing that he had responded to injustice with strategy, integrity, and intelligence. During this time, Marcus also began to plan his next steps. He knew that while the lake incident had created awareness, long-term change required continued reflection and action. He considered ways to engage with the community constructively, to promote dialogue, fairness, and understanding. Marcus realized that his role was not just as a responder to injustice but as someone who could influence the neighborhood toward better awareness, respect, and collaboration. As the situation gradually stabilized, Marcus noticed subtle changes in the community. Conversations about fairness and accountability continued, and residents began to pay more attention to leadership decisions. The lake remained a visible reminder that actions, even small and careful ones, could create awareness and dialogue. Marcus understood that his intervention had lasting value, not because it disrupted the lake, but because it sparked thought, reflection, and discussion among neighbors. By the end of this period, Marcus had strengthened his sense of purpose and self-confidence. He had learned that intelligence, patience, and careful action could achieve meaningful impact without harm. The community had begun to reflect on fairness, authority, and accountability, and the ripple effects of his thoughtful intervention were continuing to unfold. Marcus felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that he had responded to injustice in a way that honored his principles and promoted awareness, dialogue, and thoughtful consideration. Marcus's experience in this period demonstrated the power of strategy, observation, and ethical action. The lake incident had become a lesson in responsibility, reflection, and influence. It had shown that even small, measured actions could create meaningful change, spark awareness, and encourage critical thinking. Marcus had transformed frustration and injustice into intelligence, patience, and opportunity, and in doing so, he had reclaimed a sense of control, dignity, and purpose. In the days that followed, Marcus continued to live his life with quiet focus. He tended to his property, engaged in personal projects, and observed the community with thoughtful detachment. The lake incident had passed, but its effects lingered, influencing conversations, raising awareness, and prompting reflection on fairness and authority. Marcus understood that his careful, strategic approach had created lasting value, demonstrating that intelligence, responsibility, and patience were powerful tools for responding to injustice. Through this experience, Marcus learned that true influence comes not from aggression or confrontation, but from careful observation, thoughtful planning, and measured action. He had responded to the destruction of his barn with strategy, integrity, and intelligence, and in doing so, he had created a ripple effect of awareness, discussion, and reflection within his community. The lake incident had proven that even small after the lake incident had settled, Marcus felt a sense of calm that he had not experienced in months. The tension in the neighborhood had gradually eased, and the HOA seemed to be more cautious and thoughtful in their actions. Residents were still talking about the lake, but now the conversations had shifted from speculation and frustration to reflection and understanding. Marcus noticed that people were beginning to question how they treated one another and the fairness of the community rules. This was exactly the change he had hoped for: not revenge, not confrontation, but awareness and thoughtfulness. Marcus continued his daily routine, tending to his small farm and repairing the damages from the barn demolition. Every nail he hammered and every plant he cared for reminded him of resilience, patience, and the importance of hard work. He often smiled quietly, thinking about how his small but deliberate action at the lake had caused a ripple effect, prompting reflection without chaos. He realized that life was full of challenges and unfair situations, but how one responded could create opportunities for growth and change. Neighbors began to approach Marcus differently. Some greeted him with curiosity, others with respect, and a few with tentative apologies for past misunderstandings. It was subtle, but he noticed a shift in attitudes. People who had once dismissed his concerns now asked his opinion on community matters. Marcus understood that his measured response had earned him a quiet credibility. He did not seek recognition, but he appreciated that his actions had created space for dialogue and consideration. The HOA, still recovering from the lake incident, implemented new measures. They conducted better inspections, improved communication with residents, and reconsidered some policies that had previously caused tension. Marcus saw that his action, though subtle, had influenced the leadership to think more carefully about their decisions. While he did not involve himself directly, he felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that fairness and thoughtfulness were gaining attention. The change was slow but meaningful. Marcus also reflected on his own growth. The destruction of his barn had been painful, but it had taught him the value of patience, strategy, and measured action. The lake incident became a turning point in his life, a moment when he realized that responding thoughtfully to injustice could create more meaningful impact than anger or confrontation ever could. He felt stronger, wiser, and more confident in his ability to navigate difficult situations. One morning, while walking by the lake, Marcus noticed families enjoying the water again. Children were laughing, couples were paddling in small boats, and neighbors were gathering peacefully along the shore. It was a reminder that life moved forward, and even challenges could transform into learning experiences. Marcus felt a quiet joy watching the scene, knowing that the lake was safe and that his actions had contributed to reflection, not harm. The balance he had achieved gave him a sense of inner peace. The local community began to organize small events and gatherings with renewed attention to fairness and cooperation. Residents discussed ways to improve the neighborhood, volunteering for clean UPS, and planning activities that involved everyone. Marcus participated quietly, offering advice when asked but mostly observing. He appreciated seeing neighbors work together, realizing that collaboration, respect, and communication were more powerful than conflict or resentment. The atmosphere in the neighborhood slowly became more harmonious. Marcus also considered the lessons that could be shared with others. He began mentoring younger residents, explaining the importance of careful thought, strategy, and patience when responding to unfair situations. He spoke about problem solving, ethical actions, and maintaining dignity even when provoked. Many young neighbors listened intently, inspired by Marcus's ability to navigate challenges without causing harm. He realized that influence came not from loud confrontation but from example and thoughtful guidance. During this time, Marcus strengthened relationships with a few key neighbors who had shown openness to dialogue. They would gather over coffee, sharing ideas about community improvement, personal growth, and mutual respect. These conversations were uplifting and constructive, emphasizing understanding over judgment. Marcus felt that these connections were a direct result of the subtle but meaningful impact of his actions. The lake incident had not only created awareness but also fostered relationships built on mutual respect. Even as life settled into a steady rhythm, Marcus never forgot the initial injustice of his barn being demolished. Instead of dwelling on anger, he transformed that experience into motivation to act with intelligence and care. He maintained his farm, nurtured his land, and watched his garden flourish. Each day, he reflected on the importance of resilience, learning, and ethical decision-making. Marcus understood that life's challenges were opportunities for growth, and he embraced each lesson with patience and thoughtfulness. One day, during a neighborhood meeting, the HOA board acknowledged the need for better communication and fairness. They discussed policies for property management, safety, and community engagement. Marcus listened quietly from the back of the room, aware that his indirect actions had influenced this moment. While no one mentioned the lake incident directly, the discussion reflected the lessons he had hoped to convey: fairness, awareness, and the importance of responsible leadership. Marcus felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. Over the next few months, Marcus's presence in the community became a symbol of patience, intelligence, and ethical action. Neighbors respected his approach, and many sought his advice on conflicts or decisions. He continued to respond thoughtfully, never seeking recognition or reward. Marcus understood that true impact came from consistent, careful action and the ability to influence others through example rather than confrontation. His life had become an illustration of resilience and strategic thinking. Marcus also took time to reflect on the broader lessons of the lake incident. He realized that life often presented situations where fairness was overlooked, and authority could be misused. But he also understood that change was possible when approached thoughtfully. By acting with care, patience, and intelligence, he had created awareness, fostered reflection, and promoted understanding without harming anyone. The experience strengthened his belief in the power of strategy, ethical action, and responsible decision-making. The community slowly became more cohesive. Residents worked together, volunteered for projects, and discussed policies with greater thoughtfulness. The HOA, influenced by the lessons learned from the lake incident, approached decisions with more transparency and fairness. Marcus observed these changes with quiet satisfaction, knowing that meaningful impact often came from small but well-considered actions. He realized that patience and intelligence could accomplish far more than immediate reactions or anger. Marcus also strengthened his personal life. He continued to care for his property, maintain relationships with neighbors, and mentor younger residents. His farm prospered, his garden flourished, and he found joy in the simple, steady rhythm of daily life. The lake incident, once a source of tension, had become a lesson in strategy, responsibility, and the power of thoughtful action. Marcus understood that life's challenges were opportunities for growth and that resilience and patience could transform difficulties into meaningful outcomes. By the end of the year, the neighborhood had changed. Discussions about fairness, responsibility, and leadership were common. Residents were more engaged, cooperative, and aware of the importance of dialogue and reflection. Marcus, while modest and reserved, recognized that his actions had contributed to this change. He felt a sense of pride, not for recognition or praise, but for having responded thoughtfully to injustice and helped foster awareness, discussion, and respect within the community. As the seasons changed, Marcus often sat by the lake, watching the water glisten in the sunlight. Children played, neighbors walked their dogs, and families enjoyed the calm, peaceful atmosphere. The lake, once a source of tension, had become a symbol of balance, reflection, and thoughtful action. Marcus understood that his careful response had created not just temporary disruption but lasting awareness, dialogue, and consideration. The lesson was clear: intelligence, patience, and ethical action could influence change far more effectively than anger or retaliation. In quiet moments, Marcus reflected on his journey. The demolition of his barn had been painful, the HOA's lack of fairness had been frustrating, and the path he chose required patience, observation, and careful planning. But the outcome had been more valuable than he could have imagined. The lake incident had created dialogue, reflection, and change, not through confrontation, but through strategy and thoughtfulness. Marcus had learned that standing up for oneself could be done with intelligence, dignity, and ethical action. By the time spring arrived, Marcus felt a sense of fulfillment. His property was restored, the community had grown more thoughtful, and relationships with neighbors had strengthened. The lake sparkled in the morning sun, a reminder of patience, resilience, and the quiet power of careful action. Marcus had turned a painful experience into an opportunity for growth, reflection, and influence, demonstrating that fairness, strategy, and responsibility could shape outcomes more effectively than anger or conflict ever could. In the end, Marcus had not only reclaimed a sense of control over his own life but had also inspired subtle, meaningful change in the community. He had proven that thoughtful action, patience, and intelligence could respond to injustice, promote awareness, and encourage reflection without causing harm. Life had taught him that even small, careful steps could create ripples of change, and Marcus embraced each day with calm, confidence, and quiet determination.